Follow LangFocus on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Hello everyone, welcome to the LangFocus channel and my name is Paul. Today we'll be answering the question, how similar are Spanish and Italian? Spanish and Italian are both members of the Romance language family, which developed from dialects of Vulgar Latin which were spoken throughout the Roman Empire. For more information on their history and development, check out my video on the Romance language family right here. Like any pair of Romance languages, Spanish and Italian have a lot in common, and they are mutually intelligible to some extent, especially in their written form and when spoken slowly and clearly. Some speakers of Spanish and Italian report that they are able to have extended conversations with speakers of the other language, provided that they both speak slowly and clearly and they stop to clarify unfamiliar vocabulary. But despite their similarity, Spanish and Italian are also different in many ways. Let's examine both of the languages together and we'll see just what's similar and different about them. Vocabulary. Spanish and Italian have about 82% lexical similarity. That means that 82% of the words in either language will have cognate vocabulary in the other language. Let's look at some examples of Spanish and Italian cognates. In Italian, giardino, and in Spanish,
jardín,
and these mean garden. In Italian, posto, and in Spanish,
puesto,
this means place. In Italian, fiore, and in Spanish,
flor,
this means flower. In Italian, probabile, and in Spanish,
probable,
this means probable or likely. In Italian, porto, and in Spanish,
puerto.
this means port. Those pairs of words are quite obvious cognates. Let's look at a couple of less obvious cognates as well. In Italian, figlio. In Spanish,
hijo.
in Italian, chiave. In Spanish,
Llave,
in Italian, casa. And in Spanish,
caja.
now let's look at a couple of sentences to see how many of the words are similar. First in Spanish,
Estoy leyendo un buen libro.
and in Italian, sto leggendo un buon libro. This means I'm reading a good book. So in these two sentences, all of the vocabulary is equivalent or cognate. Another example, in Spanish,
Necesito cambiar un poco de dinero.
in Italian, ho bisogno di cambiare un po' di soldi. These sentences mean I need to change a little money. The way to express need is different in the two sentences. In Spanish it's
Necesito.
and in Italian it's ho bisogno di. In Spanish, the way to say a little is un poco. In Italian, it's un po'. In Italian, you can also say un poco, which is correct, but it's more common to say un po'. Next, the preposition, like of, is de in Spanish, and it's di in Italian. The word for money is
dinero,
in Spanish, and it's soldi in Italian. So in this case, you can see that some of the vocabulary is the same or equivalent, but not all of it. And one more example. In Spanish,
Tengo que encontrar un banco.
and in Italian, devo trovare una banca. These sentences mean I need to find a bank. In these sentences, we see need expressed in different ways than in the last pair of sentences. In Spanish, it's tengo que, while in Italian, it's devo. But in Spanish, it's also possible to say debo, an obvious cognate of devo. The word meaning to find is also different. In Spanish, it's encontrar, but in Italian, it's trovare. Actually, the Spanish word can also mean to meet, and there's a different Italian word, incontrare, which is a cognate of encontrar, but it only means to meet, not to find. Next, you can see that the words for bank are cognates, but interestingly, they have different gender. In Spanish, it's masculine, which we can see from the article un and the o at the end of banco, and in Italian, it's feminine, which we can see from the article una and the a at the end of banca. So from these examples, we can see that there's a lot of crossover between Spanish vocabulary and Italian vocabulary, but there are also some false friends to watch out for. False friends? No, I don't mean two-faced people who talk behind your back. I mean words that look and sound similar in either language and likely share a common origin, but they have a different meaning or usage in each language. For example, in Spanish,
Pronto,
means soon. In Italian, pronto means ready. In Spanish,
guardar,
means to keep or to guard. In Italian, guardare means to look at. In Spanish,
Oficina.
means office. In Italian, officina means workshop. There's a different word in Italian, ufficio, which means office. In Spanish,
embarazada,
means pregnant, but in Italian, imbarazzata means embarrassed. False friends like these are a common source of confusion for people who learn a language that's similar to one they already know. If we only look at lexical similarity, Spanish has more in common with Portuguese than it does with Italian, and Italian has more in common with French than it does with Spanish. In either case, it's 89% lexical similarity. But Spanish and Italian are more similar in pronunciation than those other pairs of languages, which can sometimes lead to more intelligibility. Pronunciation. Spanish has 5 vowel sounds: a, I, u, e, o. Italian also has these 5 vowel sounds plus 2 additional ones. Italian has 2 E sounds, open E, like the E in bed, and closed E, a, like the vowel sound in say. It also has 2 O sounds, open O, ah, like the O in pop, and a closed O sound, o, like the O in pope. And both Spanish and Italian have a similar rhotic R sound. One notable difference between Spanish and Italian pronunciation is that almost all Italian words end in a vowel, but in Spanish this is not the case. For example, in Italian, costare, which means to cost, but in Spanish it's
costar.
So the Italian word ends in a vowel while the Spanish word ends in a consonant. If you watch out for this, you'll notice it quite a lot. Pronunciation and orthography. In both Spanish and Italian, C and G become soft when followed by I or E. But the soft sound is different in each language. In Spanish, the soft C sounds like th or s. In Italian, it sounds like ch. In Spanish, the soft G sounds like ch. In Italian, it sounds like j. For example, in Spanish,
ciudad,
and in Italian, città. This means city. In Spanish,
gente,
means people. But in Italian, it's gente. In Spanish,
general,
means general. In Italian, it's generale. Some words, like those above, are cognates that sound different. There are other words that sound more similar, but have to be written differently to reflect their sound. The word for what in Spanish is que, spelt with QU, and in Italian, it's que, spelt with CH. In Spanish, if you want to have a hard C sound before I or E, you have to spell it as QU. In Italian, you have to spell it as CH. And while CH always represents a hard C sound in Italian, in Spanish it represents the sound ch, like in English. So in Italian you have cioccolato, spelled with CI at the beginning, but in Spanish you have
chocolate,
spelled with CH. In Spanish you have
cuando,
meaning when, and
cuánto,
meaning how much. And in Italian you have quando and quanto. In Spanish you can't write it with QU because that always represents a hard C sound, so the words would end up sounding like cando and canto. Some of the differences in pronunciation and orthography between Spanish and Italian are fairly systematic. For example, E in Italian often becomes IE in Spanish. For example, tempo becomes
tiempo,
dente becomes
diente,
and when in Italian you have SC, SF, or SP, or ST at the beginning of a word, in Spanish these are often preceded by an E. For example, scrivere in Italian becomes
escribir,
in Spanish, and speciale in Italian becomes
especial.
in Spanish. One other thing to note is that double consonants are very common in Italian, but in Spanish most consonants can't be doubled. For example, in Italian, gatto means cat, but in Spanish it's
gato,
and in Italian, tazza means cup, but it's
taza,
in Spanish. Grammar. The general word order of Spanish and Italian is very similar. Have a look at these two sentences. In Spanish,
él no comerá con nosotros mañana.
in Italian, lui non mangerà con noi domani. You can see that there's some different vocabulary, but the sentences are translatable word for word. Notice that in both languages, the subject pronoun is normally optional because the verb is conjugated for person and number. Another example. In Spanish,
Le he escrito una carta.
in Italian, gli ho scritto una lettera. This means I wrote him a letter. So here the word order is still exactly the same. And notice that the object pronoun comes before the conjugated verb, in this case the auxiliary verb, in both languages. Italian grammar has a couple of complications that Spanish doesn't have. Articles. Articles in Italian are more complicated than in Spanish. In Spanish, the indefinite articles are
Un,
for masculine nouns and
una,
for feminine nouns. Also in Italian, it's un and una, but un becomes uno before words beginning in S or Z followed by another consonant. And una becomes un apostrophe before a noun beginning with a vowel. So in Italian we have un passaporto, but uno studente. And we have una chiave, but un'italiana. Spanish and Italian both have 4 basic definite articles. In Spanish they are
el,
for masculine singular,
la,
for feminine singular,
los,
for masculine plural,
las.
feminine plural. In Italian, they're il for masculine singular, la for feminine singular, I for masculine plural, and le for feminine plural. But il becomes lo before words beginning with S or Z plus another consonant, and it becomes L apostrophe before a vowel. And I becomes y before S or Z plus another consonant. So we have il passaporto, but lo studente, which are both masculine singular, and we have I passaporti, but gli studenti, which are both masculine plural. Also, both la and le become L apostrophe before a vowel. Possessive pronouns. The way possessive pronouns are used is also a little bit different. In Italian, possessive pronouns are normally used together with a definite article, except when we talk about family members. But in Spanish, the definite article is not required. So in Italian, you have la mia bicicletta, and in Spanish, you have
Mi bicicleta.
So notice in Spanish, there's no definite article la. Another difference to notice here is that in Spanish, there is no distinction between masculine and feminine possessive pronouns. In Italian, there's mia for feminine singular and mio for masculine singular, but in Spanish, there's just mi for both. Verbs. The verb tense is used, and the way that verbs are conjugated is really quite similar in both languages. Of course, the exact conjugations are not quite the same, but they are fairly similar. Here's a sentence meaning, they will live in New York. The verb to live in Italian is vivere, and in Spanish it's
Vivir.
the sentence in Italian, loro vivranno a New York. In Spanish,
Ellos vivirán en Nueva York.
we can see that the third person plural future tense conjugation is similar, but notice that the Italian one ends in a double consonant and a vowel. Now let's look at a sentence in the past, in the present perfect to be precise. This sentence means she bought too many things. In Italian, lei ha comprato troppe cose. And in Spanish,
Ella ha comprado demasiadas cosas.
the present perfect tense is formed the same way in both languages. First, here is the auxiliary verb meaning to have, avere in Italian,
Haber.
in Spanish. That's followed by the past participle of the verb meaning to buy, comprare in Italian, and
Comprar.
in Spanish. One thing to note about the present perfect tense is that in Italian, most verbs take the auxiliary verb avere, to have, but some verbs take essere, meaning to be, as their auxiliary verb. That's similar to in French, but in Spanish, the only auxiliary verb is
Haber.
meaning to have. So in Italian, there's è entrato, meaning he entered, but in Spanish, it's
Ha entrado.
Those are just a couple of examples, but basically all verb tenses and all verb forms have an equivalent or a parallel in the other language. Bringing it all together, let's just look at a couple more sentences and see what we find along the way. This sentence means, Maria is less intelligent than her sister. In Spanish,
María es menos inteligente que su hermana.
and in Italian, Maria è meno intelligente di sua sorella. Here we can see that the word order is the same, and we can basically translate the sentences word for word. The third person female form of the verb to be is similar but slightly different. The word for less is similar but slightly different. The word for intelligent is similar, but in Spanish the G sound is softened to a h, while in Italian it's softened to a j. And the Italian word has a doubled L. The preposition used is also different. The possessive pronoun is similar, but in Spanish there is no gender distinction, and the word for sister is different in the two languages. As you can see, Spanish and Italian have a lot of similarities, including basically the same word order, similar grammar, a lot of similar vocabulary, and generally speaking, similar pronunciation. But there are still significant differences, particularly in vocabulary, pronunciation, and orthography. They are different enough that they are unmistakably two different languages, but they're similar enough that there is a certain degree of mutual intelligibility. And that degree of mutual intelligibility can probably be greatly increased by studying even the basics of the other language. But producing the other language accurately is obviously another matter, and that would require dedicated study. Okay, the question of the day. For native speakers of Spanish and Italian, how well can you understand the other language, both in speech and in writing? And have you ever tried to converse with a speaker of the other language using only your native languages? How did that work out? And for learners of Spanish and Italian, how much does your knowledge of one of those languages help you make sense of the other? Let us know in the comments down below. Be sure to follow LangFocus on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And as always, I would like to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters, especially these ones right here on the screen, for their monthly pledges. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.